And we are going to be with our guest for about a half hour more. Harlem is next. Charles on our Democrats line.
Hi. Good morning, Pedro, and hello, Michelle. I'd just like to air a sentiment that perhaps goes back even to the British Empire, which promotes the notion that there has been a perpetuation of an illusion that translates into the notion behind the so-called new Jim Crow. It's not new at all. It's been perpetuated and is perhaps the best kept secret in the universe. The matter of the different masters who seem to have collaborated with one another. For instance, different kinds of masters use a different nature of oppression. The British have an expression that goes something like this: it is not only in the administration of justice it must be so, but that it must also appear to be so. So there has been an ongoing Ponzi scheme, is to say the least, of a perpetuation of an idea, and we suffer, both black and white, from mass impressionism. And our younger people who are caught up in this bubble, it's really sad because they have no idea, they have no frame of reference, and as adults, we've fallen down tremendously on the job of communicating it to them, so that's why you see them going around with their pants dropped down and all of that. But aside from that, you know, it's the best kept secret in the universe. I'd sort of like to hear your comments on that, and thank you so very much for listening. Happy New Year.
Well, thank you for your comment. I spend the first chapter of my book describing in some detail kind of the cyclical rebirths of racial caste in America. You know, since our nation's founding, African Americans have repeatedly been controlled through institutions like slavery and Jim Crow, which appear to die, but then kind of emerge in new form tailored to the needs and constraints of the time. And I think what we're seeing today, or what we have seen over the past few decades, is the emergence within a relatively short period of time of this massive new system of control that appears colorblind, but in fact operates much in the same way that earlier systems of control once did. In fact, you know, in some cities, like take the Chicago area, for example, in some cities, more than half of working-age African-American men today have been branded felons. And are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. You know, the clock really has been turned back on racial progress in America today, but, you know, scarcely anyone seems to notice. All eyes are kind of fixed on Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey, but for a huge portion of the African American population in particular, you know, life is much like it once was 50 years ago.
We have Kybell Wilson off of Twitter who asked, the blacks in prison were sent there by a mixture of black, white juries and judges, so what went wrong, is her question.
That's an excellent question, because I think one of the myths, the prevailing myths, is that kind of merely by kind of sprinkling African Americans through police departments and prosecutors' offices, or appointing more black judges, that will solve the problem of racial bias in the criminal justice system. And that's just not accurate. You know, until we change the policies, practices, and the design of the institutions that are responsible for waging the drug war, and eliminate all the financial incentives that currently exist, you know, cash giveaways to local law enforcement agencies and state highway patrols that boost their drug arrest numbers regardless of whether drug crime is going up or down in those communities. Drug forfeiture laws which allow law enforcement agencies to keep for their own use the cash, cars, and homes of people who've been accused of drug offenses. Until we change those kinds of policies and practices and the basic structure of this new system of control, just sprinkling people of color into these pre-existing institutions and expecting them to, enforce these policies but in a slightly kinder, gentler way, I think it's unreasonable to expect different outcomes just by kind of changing the complexion of folks that are charged with implementing policies and practices that are inherently discriminatory.
To that thinking, then, would you change drug laws?
Absolutely.
How so?
Absolutely. Well, first off, I would drastically reduce the amount of time that people are serving in prison for drug offenses. It's just unheard of anywhere else in the world.
Regardless of the drug, whether it be marijuana
actually,
or cocaine?
Given the amount of increase, in the 1980s, Congress and state legislatures around the country, in many cases, doubled, tripled, quintupled the length of prison time that people would do for relatively minor drug offenses. It used to be that in the federal system, nobody spent more than a year in prison for a first-time drug offense. It was just absolutely unheard of. And in other places around the world, the amount of time people spend in prison for drug offenses can be measured in days, weeks, and months rather than years. But here, in the United States, some people are serving life sentences for marijuana possession. Life sentences for marijuana possession. People are routinely sentenced to 10, 15 years for relatively minor drug crimes. This is just absolutely, inexcusable given the nature of these offenses. These are public health problems that we should be struggling to deal with through, making drug treatment more available and counseling for offenders. So I would drastically reduce the sentences, bring them back down, so that we can begin to count them in terms of months, perhaps, rather than years. And then I think we should also seriously consider the legalization of marijuana. Much of the available research today indicates that marijuana is actually less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. And yet we have people doing life sentences for the possession of marijuana. It's an irrational system, but it's also a system that has had absolutely devastating, tragic consequences in poor communities of color where the drug war has been waged.
What would you do with the harder drugs, then?
Well, I think that there's kind of mixed research out there. And, I have an open mind to drug legalization, even for harder drugs. But, I think for our purposes right now, at least my concern right now, is, bringing us back in time to the way we used to prosecute drug crimes. If we were to go back to the form of drug law enforcement than we had in the 1970s. In fact, let me put it this way. If we were going to go back to the rate of incarceration that we had in the 1970s, a time, by the way, that many civil rights activists thought that rates of incarceration were egregiously high. But if we were going to go back to kind of the bad old days of the 1970s, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. Okay? More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system could potentially lose their jobs. That's how enormous and entrenched the system has become in an extremely short period of time. So we don't need to legalize all drugs in order to have a sane drug policy. But I think we should keep an open mind to drug legalization.